Okay, so now we're continuing on with our discussion about sociology and socialization processes, and we're coming to the last part of our discussion here, and we're going to talk about the nature-nurture debate. So in the field of sociology, when I first started studying sociology years ago, it was almost as if you were forced as a student of sociology to choose the nurture side of the house, which was that environmental factors create the person that you are, that they have all of the influence in determining your life outcome as far as who you are, how you behave, and so on and so forth. And the psychology students would all be on the nature side of that debate. They would all talk about how your DNA makes you who you are. You're born with these attributes, and that's just the way it is. There's nothing you can do to avoid becoming who your DNA tell you you're going to be. Today, we don't really talk about things in such concrete terms or black and white dichotomies. Instead, there's a more nuanced discussion. We tend to assert that there are genetic components, the nature side of the house, that you are born with that, given the right external conditions, the nurture side of the house will turn on. And I'll give you a few examples. We do know that for a lot of people, alcoholism has a genetic component. That means that the markers that make you more predisposed to being an alcoholic can be seen when we look at your genetic makeup. Does that mean you're going to be an alcoholic? Absolutely not. But it does mean that, given the right set of external circumstances, the chances of you becoming an alcoholic are greater than they are for the general population. So if you are a child of alcoholic parents and you have been identified as having that marker for alcoholism, it is possible that the environment that you grow up in with parents who are exhibiting that kind of drinking behavior can encourage that kind of behavior in you as you age. Medical science is doing a good job of uncovering and identifying all kinds of markers like this. But we have to be very, very careful not to assign too much value to them, because we don't really want to come right out and say, well, your parents were alcoholics, therefore I know you will be. We know that that's not right. And it could, this kind of thinking could serve to encourage bad behavior. Well, hey, both of my parents were criminals, therefore what chance do I have? Or I grew up in a home where my parents were abusive to each other, therefore when I get older, this is how I'm going to behave, and I have no choice over the matter. We don't want to do that. And so instead we have to be very, very careful when assigning the nature component of socialization as an external indicator of behavior. So this does present a little bit of a problem in the field of sociology, because then sometimes the question is, well, if environment determines all of our behavior, then how do we explain sexual orientation? Most of us believe strongly that we are born with our sexual orientation and that it doesn't develop over time. We believe that who we're attracted to is more or less genetically pre-programmed. And so if we're going to talk in terms of nurture being the side of the house that sociology tends to reside in, sexual orientation discussions and research become challenging for us. So we need to be asking the question, is sexual orientation a birthright? And if we believe that it is, then are there other behaviors that also are genetically present from birth? And I'll leave that question to you. If you think that's the case, what would those other behaviors be? I can't think of any that I would assign to genetics and biology except for sexual orientation. I do believe, in the immortal words of Gaga, you're born with it. And we do have some small studies to support that sexual orientation is genetically pre-programmed, so to speak. We have a couple of studies. Most of them, when we're talking about sexual orientation, most of our studies are done on twins because that does provide us with two identical people to observe or talk to, survey. So we have one small study that is ungeneralizable, meaning we can't take those results and apply them to the general population. This was a study that was done with a set of male fraternal twins and a set of identical male twins. So the difference between fraternals and identicals, or fraternals and paternals, is that fraternals don't share as much genetic material because they are fertilized by separately fertilized eggs, meaning that there are two eggs fertilized at the same time and that pregnancy and birth occurs at the same time. Identicals come from one egg fertilized and split. So the genetic material that identical twins share is greater than the genetic material that fraternal twins share. All right, so in this case, the hypothesis of sexual orientation being genetic was supported because the identical twins that were gay had a much higher percentage of also having a gay twin sibling. So if I'm an identical twin boy, the chances of my identical twin brother being gay were higher than if we were only fraternal twins. So this very small study, again, supports the conclusion that there's a genetic link to being gay. Now, this was a handful of fraternal twin sets and a handful of identical twin sets. So we have to be very, very careful with how we report those findings. All right, so another study on sexual orientation from the National Academy of Sciences. This one theorizes that gayness runs in families. And so what they did was they found families that had several male siblings, and they looked at which of those siblings were straight or gay. And their theorizing was that a male child has a higher chance of being gay if he has older male gay or straight brothers. So the hypothesis, the odds of being gay increase the more older male siblings a male child has. And they did this study with all kinds of different brothers, and what they found was in the families with blood brothers, not adopted or stepbrothers, you had a higher chance of being gay if you were one of the younger male siblings to those blood brothers. So this study attempted to control for those environmental or nurture factors by including adopted brothers and step brothers, and they found that the blood brothers had a higher chance of being gay if they had older blood siblings in the family. So again, this study concludes that gayness is determined biologically, occurs in the womb. And the scientists for this study even went a step further. They thought about why that could be. And what they determined was, or what they thought is, that the hormonal makeup of the mother and what she shares with the fetus changes over pregnancies. And so the suggestion is that the amount of sex hormones that pass from the mother to the children diminishes over time, and therefore there is a component, a genetic component to the pregnancy that perhaps encourages younger male siblings to have more of a propensity towards being gay. Boy, that was a mouthful, huh? All right, the last interesting thing we want to talk about here is isolation or interruption of the socialization process and what happens there. If you've already had a psychology course, of course, you've been introduced to some of the more well-known cases of feral children. But this, tends to happen every couple of years. There's a big news story about some child or children that have been uncovered, isolated in a home, or they lived in a basement or attic for many, many years. The problem that we encounter with feral children is that primary socialization that we talked about back at the beginning of this lecture is disrupted. And when that happens, we have shown a direct relationship to how the brain's development is delayed. And so the younger the child and the more isolated the child is at a younger age, the less of a chance that child has of a full recovery. When primary socialization is disrupted, and disrupted for a period of time, it's impossible for children to catch up from that kind of disruption. Some famous cases of feral children or isolated children, there was Isabel in 1938 in Pennsylvania. She was able to gain some normal speech functions. She was discovered at the age of 7, so still relatively young. There's also the case of Jeannie, who was discovered in 1970 in California. She had been beaten and confined for 13 years, and the results with her were mixed. She always lived after that as a ward of the state. She wasn't really able to fully gain the skills necessary to care for herself because of being in isolation for so many years. And then most recently in the state of Florida, there was the case of Danielle back in 2008. She had been locked in her room for 7 years, and again, with very limited results, became a ward of the state, and as far as I know, is still living in the state's custody and care as an adult now. With these cases of feral children, we have to be careful not to generalize findings. Each one of these cases has to be examined individually. Therapeutically, each one of these children is going to have different manifestations of that feral child condition or syndrome, but the whole entire concept of feral children tells us that the longer a child remains in isolation and the earlier age the child goes into that kind of isolated circumstance, the less of a chance that child is going to have to live what we would consider to be a normal life. All right, so our final concept is going to be the concept of resocialization, which kind of fits in with the feral child discussion. This is where you are expected to shed old behaviors and adopt new ones. And as we said with feral children, this is really hard to do because they just simply don't have that skill foundation to be able to wrap their mind around adopting these new behaviors. When we talk about resocialization, however, under normal circumstances, it happens in many social institutions, and it may happen in what we call a total institution. This is the work of Erving Goffman, one of my favorite social theorists, and he said that a total institution will strip you of your identity and will make you into what it wants you to be, and that is the resocialization process for these total institutions. He said that this may involve what he called a degradation ceremony, where you literally become a new, different person. Oftentimes, this degradation ceremony is voluntarily entered into, such as if you choose to go in the military, you are immediately stripped of your own identity. You are given a uniform, you are called by your last name, and you don't really have any control over your life for the time that you're in the service. A degradation ceremony may also be attached to what we would consider to be a negative total institution. An example of that would be going to prison. You don't have any control over that, but you nonetheless adopt the behavior of being a prisoner. Some total institutions we may not think about in that way, but a good example, a boarding school where you have to wear a uniform every day, or a nunnery where you go to learn how to be a nun and devote yourself to religion. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground in this series of lectures. I hope this helps you to understand some of the important concepts from socialization from a sociological perspective. All right, take care. Bye-bye.